In a week where 6 of the AP top 10 teams lost, the Zags only fall one spot in the rankings.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and if you win, you will get started with $150 in bonus bets. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, we got a new AP poll and some new net rankings to evaluate, plus a mailbag question about Gonzaga's title hopes and some thoughts on the Zag women after they too suffered a heartbreaking overtime loss over the weekend. We'll get to that to close out the show. But first, the Zags on the men's side only moved down one spot in the AP poll. They were 7th last week. They are now 8th in the AP poll. That's pretty consistent across the other ranking systems. We've seen them. The coaches poll had Gonzaga at 9th. Locked On College Basketball, which is myself, Isaac Shade, my co-host, and our regular guest, Leaf Tulane. We all do a composite top 25 rankings. We had Gonzaga 9th. So 9th, 8th, that's kind of where the Zags have been. And I think a lot of people that I've talked to, either on the Discord channel, either through just text messages with friends, family, things of that nature, I think a lot of people thought Gonzaga would fall further than that. But the reality is, like we said, 6 of the AP top 10 teams lost. So if everybody loses, then kind of nobody loses in a sense. Obviously, there's a reason Tennessee moved to number 1 because they were one of the 4 top 10 teams that did not lose last week. And so they get the top spot, deservedly so, I think, for Tennessee. Shout out to Rick Barnes' club. They're looking really good in the early going. They have the combination of not having any losses and having enough quality wins to be in that conversation. But for Gonzaga, it was a really devastating loss because of how big of a lead Gonzaga had and how rare it is for Gonzaga to lose a game when they have that kind of lead at halftime, and all the reasons we know that it was tough. It's tough to lose to Kentucky. It's no fun to lose to Mark Pope, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, Gonzaga lost an overtime game on a neutral floor to a top 5 team in the country. From a metrics perspective, that's not going to change your resume all that much. And I think a lot of people thought, oh, they're going to move down to 13 or 15 or something like that. They're still better than the teams that around them that also lost. Kansas lost twice. Wisconsin lost twice. A lot of the teams that are in that mix, Purdue lost to Penn State. There's just Gonzaga's loss comparatively doesn't look nearly as. The West Virginia loss is worse. I think everybody knows that. That's not a secret in that regard. But Gonzaga already kind of took their hit from the West Virginia loss. They're not going to get double penalized for that one. And so I think for me, I had them 9th. The only team I had ahead of them that wasn't ahead of them in the AP poll was Florida in my personal ranking. So again, there's still a top 10 team. The Tennessee, Auburn, Iowa State, Duke, and Kentucky ends up being your top 5. Auburn drops a spot because of the loss to Duke. Iowa State remains in that conversation. They have been fantastic this season. Duke is still 4th. They are 1 spot ahead of Kentucky, which some people didn't love, considering Kentucky beat Duke head-to-head. And when you have 2 teams right next to each other in the rankings, it sure seems like that's a pretty valid reason to move one of the teams ahead of the other. But again, the AP poll is not just one person doing the rankings. It is an aggregate of everybody's rankings. So multiple people likely did have Kentucky over Duke. Obviously, multiple people did not have Kentucky over Duke. Ultimately, as a friend of the podcast, Connor Hope, said on social media, nobody's complaining that Clemson isn't ahead of Kentucky, but Clemson did beat Kentucky. So head-to-head status doesn't always matter, but it's still interesting to see Duke at 4 and Kentucky at 5. Marquette comes in at 6. Bama's at 7. Gonzaga, of course, at 8. Florida comes in at 9. And then Kansas rounds out the top 10. They fall from number 1 to number 10. Makes sense. They lost twice. Both their losses were to unranked teams. Granted, one of the losses was to Creighton, who is unranked. and should still be unranked, but I suspect we'll probably get back into the top 25 in the not too distant future, although they did lose Pop Isaacs, their star transfer portal addition in the from Texas Tech. They lost him for the rest of the season to an injury, so that's going to hurt Greg McDermott's club. But ultimately, not only do we see the coaches poll still have the Zags top 10, we see the AP poll still have the Zags the top 10 team, but the metrics, the data, the analytics, I know not everybody is super invested in analytics or values it the same way, but they all really roundly love this Gonzaga club and continue to do so. KenPom has Gonzaga fourth after the loss to Kentucky, still has Gonzaga fourth. I think they were third, so they've dropped one spot. Adjusted offensive efficiency has Gonzaga second. They're the second best offensive team in the country up to this point in the season, according to KenPom. Defensively, they are 22nd. That's really good. They're a top 25 team offensively and defensively. They're a top 5 team offensively, according to KenPom's data. The net data, which is not analytics, it is basically just purely based off of who you have beat and who you have lost to this year and how good those teams are. That is all the net is. It does not factor in anything else. The net has Gonzaga third. The only two teams that are ahead of Gonzaga in the net right now are Tennessee, who is, of course, the number 1 team in the country, and Auburn, who is the number 2 team in the country. I'm not saying Gonzaga should be third in the AP poll. Again, I voted them 9th. That's not the argument that I am making. But the computers and the systems that are out there, Evan Miyakawa's data, he's a phenomenal resource for specifically like minute-by-minute data for players. His data has Gonzaga as the best team, the best roster, the most talented team in the country. And Bart Torvik has Gonzaga as a top 5 team. There are so many models and so many different types of systems and analytics tools that continually, all of them are different in their own way, but all of them continually view Gonzaga as one of the 5, in many cases 3 best teams in the country. Going back to net, Gonzaga's 2-2 in quad 1 games on the season. Their 2 quad 1 victories are Baylor and San Diego State. Baylor's been scuffling a bit. I ultimately think there's not really any risk at the end of the season that Baylor isn't a quad 1 win for Gonzaga, although I'll say this right now. I think it's possible that at some point Baylor's kind of just hanging on by a thread of being a quad 1 win right now. So it might eventually look like a quad 2, but I think by the end of the year, Baylor will be a healthy quad 1 win for the Zags. San Diego State should remain a quad 1 win because they'd have to drop out of the top 75, and I don't think that's going to happen. West Virginia and Kentucky are both quad 1 losses. There is a bit of concern that West Virginia could ultimately end up being a quad 2 loss in time. But for right now, it's quad 1, so we'll hold on to that happily. Kentucky should remain a quad 1 loss. Gonzaga is also 2-0 in quad 2 games. That's Indiana and Arizona State. They are 1-0 in quad 3 games. That win was over Davidson. And then they have the 2 quad 4 wins, Long Beach State and UMass Lowell. So for me, I'm perfectly content with Gonzaga as 8th. I think that's right about where they belong. I think that talent-wise, I think that ceiling-wise, they are a top 5 team. They're a top 3 team. I think if they'd held on and won this game against Kentucky, there's a very real chance that they are maybe first. I don't think they would have jumped past Tennessee, but I think they might be second or third in the AP poll. But of course, because they did not close that game out, did not secure the W against Kentucky, they end up falling down to 8. But it doesn't feel like that's a wrong spot. I think for people who thought they should be lower than that, I think those people either weren't really very aware of what else happened in college basketball last week and where those teams are, and just looking at their resumes, their records, not just their, KenPom data and net and things like that, but like who they've beat and who they've lost to. Like Gonzaga's resume and everything holds up well against pretty much everybody outside of those top couple of teams, which is why they fall where they do in the standings. Well, Gonzaga's got 2 big games in the month of December. They got UConn and UCLA, both who are moving up in the AP poll. Meanwhile, St. Mary's still not generating any momentum despite continuing to win, continuing to beat good teams. The Gales getting votes, but still not close to being a top 25 team. We'll discuss whether that's going to change for Randy Bennett's club or not. All that coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, get ready to tackle the college hoops action this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and you will get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. And the Zags odds to take home a national title, they're still tied for the fourth best odds in college basketball, tied for the third best odds in college basketball. Auburn's at the top at plus 750. Duke is next at plus 900. Gonzaga and Houston both next at plus 1200. If you still like those odds for the Zags, or if there's some games coming up this week that you're interested in, just visit FanDuel.com to join today. As a reminder, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still talking about the AP poll, which came out on Monday morning, as it always does. Still talking about where Gonzaga is and where their upcoming and previous opponents are ranked in the top 25, as well as in the net, and what it means for Gonzaga's net ranking and their quad victories. And then we're also going to talk about the fact that the Week 6 AP poll in particular has carried a lot of value in terms of determining the upcoming national champion. We're going to talk about that to close out the show. Looking at Gonzaga's upcoming opponents, the UConn Huskies, who Gonzaga takes on Saturday at the Madison Square Garden, their next game. It's going to be the return of that home series where last year Gonzaga lost at Climate Pledge Arena. We talked about the curse of Climate Pledge Arena, so Gonzaga is going to take them on this time at Madison Square Garden in New York on Saturday. UConn lost 3 in a row in Maui and dropped from 2 to 25, just held on to a spot in the AP top 25. They then bounced back with wins over Baylor at home and then a win on the road against Texas at the Moody Center. Those two wins vault them from 25 back up to 18 in the AP poll. KenPom has them 13th. They're the third best offense in the country, but they are, folks, 93rd in adjusted defensive efficiency. This is not just like, oh, they're a below average good defensive team. Like, this is an actively bad defensive team. Danny Hurley's probably going to find a way to get this team better on that end of the floor as the year goes on, but they are not good at defending the basketball right now. Net has them 24th, 2-2 in quad 1 games, 0-1 in quad 2, 0-0 quad 3, and then 5-0 in their quad 4 games. For Gonzaga, this is pretty clearly going to be a quad 1 game for the Zags on that neutral floor. And we'll talk a lot more about UConn. We're going to have probably 2 full shows dedicated to getting ready for Gonzaga taking on UConn, the storylines, the matchups, what it means for Gonzaga, what it means for UConn, all of that coming up later this week. But for right now, they have moved up to 18th in the top 25, and they are a top 25 team in both net and KenPom as well. And then UCLA, who Gonzaga takes on the 28th of December. They started this month Saturday with the game against Kentucky. The next Saturday is against UConn. The next Saturday is their one kind of reprieve. They're playing Bucknell. And then the final Saturday in December is when they take on UCLA at the Intuit Dome in California, the home of the Los Angeles Clippers. UCLA ranked for the first time this season, the first time in a couple of years. They are 24th now. They were previously, of course, unranked. They're 8-1 on the year. Their only loss was to New Mexico, but they weren't getting a lot of love in the AP poll prior to this because they hadn't really beaten anybody. New Mexico is not a great team, and in fact, they have kind of hurt themselves since then. They just recently lost to New Mexico State, which is not a loss that's helping them, nor helping UCLA in that regard. But UCLA finally got the marquee W that they needed. They went on the road to Eugene, took on the Oregon Ducks, who are higher than them in the standings, beat them. So beating Oregon is a true road W for UCLA. That is enough to push them into the top 25, and I think deservedly so. I had UCLA ranked. I'm still skeptical of UCLA. Mick Cronin's system just hasn't really worked at UCLA with the personnel that they have. I think this team's starting to figure it out. They're going to be a good defensive team. They're going to slow the pace. We know what they like to do. But I'm still a little kind of cautious about UCLA at this point. But they earned their spot in the top 25 this week. And depending how they do for the next couple of weeks, should still be a top 25 team, or at least close to it, when Gonzaga takes them on at the end of the month. KenPom has them 14th. So too does the net also have them 14th. Right now, UCLA is 1-0 in quad 1 games with that win over Oregon. They're 0-1 in quad 2. New Mexico was a quad 1 loss. It's now a quad 2 loss. And then they're 2-0 quad 3, 4-0 in quad 4. St. Mary's 44th in the AP top 25? Not really. They only ranked 25 teams, but they picked up 20 votes, which puts them 44th among teams that received votes. And I'm not sure I get it. I ranked St. Mary's in my top 25. I don't see what they haven't, like, there are teams that are ranked ahead of them that I think I don't see why they are ranked when this team is not. 9-1 on the year. Their only losses to a very good Arizona State team. Obviously, if they'd won that game, it's probably a different conversation. I think if they'd won that game and they were 10-0 and they weren't getting in the top 25, I think a lot more people would be talking about it. Let's put it that way. But they have wins over Nebraska. That's a good team. They have a win over Utah. They just beat Utah on the road. That's a quad one win for them and a very solid win. They absolutely destroyed USC. And look, USC is not good. Don't get me wrong. They're not a good team, but that is still they held USC to 36 points. I think they beat them like 78-36. It was a complete and utter domination for St. Mary's. KenPom has them 34th. Net has them 33rd. They're 1-1 in those quad one games with the win over Utah, the loss to Arizona State. 1-0 in quad two. I believe that was Nebraska. 3-0 in quad three. So yes, USC was a quad three win for St. Mary's. Again, says a lot more about where Eric Musselman's team is right now. And then 3-0 in quad four. Obviously, the Zags aren't playing St. Mary's for a while, so things are going to change dramatically between now and then, but just highlighting where they are at currently. And then looking at Gonzaga's previous opponents, Kentucky, 5th in the AP poll. They fell one spot because of the loss to Clemson, and then, of course, the win over Gonzaga. 10th at KenPom, 5th in the net, 2-1 quad one, 0-0 quad two, and then 6-0 in those quad three, quad four games. That should remain a quad one loss for Gonzaga. No real risk, at least not right now, of that dropping to being a quad two loss for the Zags. San Diego State, 23rd in the AP top 25. They were 24th, so they moved up one spot. They got really nice wins over Creighton, a nice win over Houston, lost to Oregon, lost to Gonzaga, 36th at KenPom, 41st in the net. They were like 63rd in the net, so they're continuing to climb pretty rapidly in the net rankings, which is good news for Gonzaga. All they need to do is stay top 75. I would be very surprised if San Diego State ever gets even that close to being outside the top 75. This is a pretty healthy, convincing quad one win for Gonzaga. And again, as a reminder, San Diego State's still operating without Reese Waters, who was one of their best players last year. He's out with an injury. He's expected to be back, I believe, towards the end of this month, is the latest that I've heard in that regard. So once they get into conference play, there's enough good teams in the conference and enough of a likelihood that they'll continue to win those games that they'll stay top 75 and keep that quad one win for Gonzaga. Baylor picked up 150 votes, which meant they just missed being a top 25 team. They finished 26th in the rankings. They are out of the top 25 right now, 5-3 on the year. Their losses are all good losses. They lost to Gonzaga, who's, of course, a top 10 team. They lost to Tennessee, who's now the number one team. They lost to UConn, and that was a true road loss for Baylor. So nothing really super concerning for Scott Drew's team. They have wins over St. John's, who's a good team that we have ranked in our top 25, although the AP doesn't have them there. They have a win over Arkansas, who's not in the top 25 right now, but could be. They're 23rd at KenPom. They're 28th in the net, 2-3 in quad one games. So 3 quad one losses, obviously not good, but I think it highlights the fact that they've already played 5 quad one games and they haven't even gotten into Big 12 conference play. This team is going to be loaded the heck up with quad one games this season. Scott Drew, he wanted to challenge this team. He gave them an absolute gauntlet this season. They have not played a quad two game. They're 1-0 in quad three and then 2-0 in quad four games. Again, 28th at the net. They got to stay top 30. I believe that game is considered a road game or a home game for Gonzaga. That's what it was listed as on the NCAA website. We'll see. Sometimes there's some conversation about that. If that game ends up being considered a true home game for Gonzaga, then Baylor would have to stay in the top 30. If it ends up being counted as a neutral site game, then they would just have to stay in the top 50. Either way, I know they're hanging on to a top 30 spot right now. I think Baylor's going to end up being comfortably inside the top 30, so that should remain a quad one win. That to say, Baylor and San Diego State, 2 quad one games Gonzaga has right now. I think they both stay quad one wins for Gonzaga going forward. Gonzaga also has a win over Arizona State, who as of right now is 34th at the net. They need to be a top 30 team to be quad one, so it is very comfortably a quad two game. I'm not as confident that Arizona State will get and stay in the top 30. They're going to have a gauntlet in the Big 12, just like Baylor. I don't know if they win enough games to make it into the top 30 and to stay in the top 30, but it's very comfortably going to be a quad 2 win for Gonzaga. And it's possible that Bobby Hurley's team doesn't. I mean, they're a very young team. If they continue to gel, continue to get better, it's a real possibility that team ends up giving Gonzaga another quad 1 win. 50th at KenPom right now. They received 143 votes in the AP poll, putting them just behind Baylor for 27th among the teams receiving votes. And then Indiana and West Virginia each got 30 votes in the AP poll, which is 40th. Among the teams that received votes, tied for 40th, I should say. Indiana's 5-2 on the year. They got smoked by Louisville and Gonzaga. They beat South Carolina and Providence. They're 44th at KenPom, 57th in the net. They got to be top 50 to be a quad 1 game for Gonzaga. It's possible. Wouldn't shock me if Indiana gets better as the year goes on and ends up being a quad 1 game for Gonzaga. Right now, though, it's comfortably in quad 2, and I think it's going to sit there for now. West Virginia, quad 1 game for Gonzaga right now, 39th in the net. They need to be top 50, stay in the top 50 since it's a neutral site in order for that to be a quad 1 game. I think one of the games between Indiana and West Virginia will end up quad 1. It would be a bummer if they both ended up quad 2. That happens. Obviously, you want the West Virginia. You want them both to be quad 1. It always helps. You don't want to have a quad 2 loss, so you'd like West Virginia to stay quad 1. Quad 1 losses look better, but we'll see if that ends up happening or not. I'm not overly concerned about these things at this point. We'll see how Gonzaga does against UCLA and UConn, and then getting into conference play. But it's just worth kind of taking a look at where those things are at this point in the offseason. Well, folks, the last 21 national champions were all ranked inside the top 12 of the AP poll during week 6 of the season. So Gonzaga, as the 8th ranked team here in week 6, they are still fully in the mix to be your 2025 national champions. We're going to discuss that and more coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, nothing delivers comfort and joy quite like the unrivaled quality and taste of Omaha Steaks. It's guaranteed perfection in every single bite. And folks, right now you can save on unforgettable gifts with 50% off site-wide at omahasteaks.com. Plus, score an extra $30 off with promo code COLLEGE. With 5 generations of experience, they consistently deliver the world's best steak experience, and the gifting experts at Omaha Steaks have made it easy to deliver the perfect gift with thoughtfully curated gift packages featuring gourmet favorites. From legendary steaks to mouth-watering desserts and more, save 50% off site-wide for a limited time at omahasteaks.com. Plus, our listeners get an extra $30 off with promo code COLLEGE. That's 50% off at omahasteaks.com and an extra $30 off with promo code COLLEGE. Minimum purchase may apply. All right, folks, segment 3, still Eddie Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we're still talking about the AP poll here. We got one mailbag question to get to, and then we're going to close out the show talking about the Gonzaga women's basketball team and their heartbreaking loss at Colorado State on Sunday. But first, we got a question here from Austin via Discord. Austin says, since 2003, the NCAA champion has come from the top 12 in week 6 of the AP poll. It is week 6 and Gonzaga is number 8. I still believe Gonzaga is capable of putting together an amazing season and can win it all. What are your thoughts? Yeah, absolutely. You know, I kind of answered a lot of the thoughts that I have about this question in the first segment, so I won't try not to repeat myself too much, but I find it, I don't want to say baffling. I understand the nature of fandom. I get it. I feel it myself. Watching a team blow a lead, watching a team lose the way that Gonzaga lost to Kentucky is devastating and frustrating and anger-inducing and all of that. But again, the idea that this team's ceiling is lower because they lost to a really good, really experienced, really old and talented Kentucky team in overtime just doesn't sit right with me. I don't feel like Gonzaga's ceiling is any lower. And I think part of what is kind of baffling me right now is that there are people within this fan base who are seemingly writing off Gonzaga's upside or writing off their potential to compete for a national championship this point in the season, early December. And it's like, did these same people watch the team last year? Do you remember what this team looked like in December of last year? I do. I had a headache the entire month. I was not used to recording shows after losses at the level and the volume that I had to do last year. I think I made comments that I covered Drew Timmy's entire career at Gonzaga as a podcaster, and he lost 10 games. I covered half that many losses last year. It was startling and surprising and frustrating. But what happened last year when the team clicked? When the new players, and again, Gonzaga had new players at the most critical positions in Gonzaga's offense last year, point guard and center. When those players clicked, when they clicked with each other, when they clicked with the rest of the system, that team exploded. There was other things that happened. Ben Gregg moving into the starting lineup. We talked about that being a big catalyst for the team last year. But ultimately, that team was not very good at the beginning of the year. They lost games they shouldn't lose. They lost at home to San Diego State. Obviously, the Santa Clara loss was a big one. They lost to Washington on the road. But that team was not as talented as this team, and they still put it all together and made the Sweet 16. And that team was carried in the early part of the year by Anton Watson and Nolan Hickman because they were the veterans who'd been in the system, who were familiar with what Mark Few wanted them to do. This year's team has more players who are comfortable in the system because Ryan Nembhard's in year 2. Graham Ike is in year 2. You also have Nolan Hickman in year 4. Ben Gregg is in year 4. You have guys who are more comfortable and more prepared for this system, which is why this early part of the season hasn't been as challenging as it was last year. But the players who are struggling right now are the same, are not the same players, but are in the same spot as new players to the system. We talked about Michael Ajayi a fair amount on Monday's episode. If you didn't tune in, check it out. Give it a listen. We talked a lot in the third segment about Ajayi and his struggles early in the year and why we're fairly confident in that he will click, that he will figure it out as he gets more comfortable coming from a system that was pretty much non-existent at Pepperdine under Lorenzo Romar to this system, and his role changing dramatically from being a high usage ball dominant player to being in a much different role here with the Zags. Caleb Battle, maybe his growth and development is a little bit different just because I think he's a player who's going to be a little bit up and down. That's who he is. That's part of the Caleb Battle experience. But at the same time, I think both those players are going to get better in the second half of the season. We saw it last year with Gonzaga's transfer portal additions. There's little reason to expect that these players won't get better as this season goes on. Caleb Battle improved dramatically from the start of his season at Arkansas to the end of his season at Arkansas. Considering that trajectory has already happened with Battle and Gonzaga's track record of seeing transfers thrive in this system and get better as the year goes on. Malachi Smith got better as his first season went on. Rasir Bolton got better as his first season went on. Jordan Matthews got better as his first season went on. There is so much data and indication and proof that Caleb Battle will likely get better as his season goes on. Same with Michael Ajayi. Guess what this team looks like if those two guys are playing like they're capable of playing? Better than last year's team, that's for sure. I absolutely, and I already mentioned, again, I don't want to repeat myself, but every analytic model, which has the benefit of not feeling the same emotions that we feel and feeling the frustration of why didn't Gonzaga figure out how to handle that zone and why couldn't they make a 3 in the second half and why didn't Mark Few make adjustments and all those justified feelings that not just, I don't want to make it seem like it's just you all having, I had them too. Trust me, the people around me at the game, they know what I was feeling. But that the computers, they don't feel any of that. And they look at this team, they look at not just the roster, but they look at their actual performances on the season. And all of them, which are all calculated differently, have Gonzaga as one of the 5 best teams in the country. So to me, the idea that Gonzaga is not still capable of competing for a national championship is only being peddled by people who are either just direct haters of the program or people who are still emotional coming off of, again, a loss that Gonzaga hasn't suffered that kind of loss in years and years. So it was an unprecedented feeling to watch Gonzaga squander a 16-point halftime lead and lose to a team that didn't lead that game until overtime. That is incredibly frustrating, but it does not mean Gonzaga does not have the ability to compete for a national championship. They are fully involved in that conversation right now, as they should be. Quickly wrap up the show here. Talked about the Lady Zags losing to Colorado State on Sunday, 74-72 in overtime. A lot of the same stuff. Unfortunately, Mark Few and Lisa Fortier can kind of wallow in a lot of the same frustrations as the Zag women had a 20-point halftime lead against Colorado State, squandered that lead entirely, went into overtime, lost in overtime. They were outscored 24-9 in the third quarter. They were outscored by 5 in the fourth quarter and then by 2 in overtime. And it's kind of been a lot of the same things with this team. The depth is just not there. And we know it's injury related, and it's so frustrating as we await Taylor Dalton's return from injury, Lauren Whitaker's return from injury. The front court was great. Yvonne Ejim, 22 points, 5 boards for her. Maud Hybens had the best game she's had at least this season, if not in her career. 15 points, 19 rebounds, and an assist for her. Both of them had phenomenal offensive performances. Allie Turner is a budding superstar. She is going to be an all-time great at Gonzaga if she stays for all 4 years. As a freshman, she has been one of, if not the leading scorer in many of Gonzaga's games. She had 18 in this one with 9 assists and 2 turnovers. She was phenomenal. Claire O'Connor had another great game as well. 9 points, 3 rebounds. She didn't have any turnovers and was 4 of 6 from the field, but there just wasn't enough from anybody else. That's 4 of your 5 starters. Your other starter was Esther Little. She played 39 minutes, but only scored 1 point. She did have 11 boards. She had 3 assists, but she had 5 turnovers. She didn't miss a bunch of shots. She was only 0 of 2, but again, she played 39 minutes and had 3 assists and 5 turnovers. Just really brutal stuff from her in this one. And then the bench, they're just not getting enough from the bench right now. 7 points total from their bench in an overtime game, 2 of 9 shooting from the bench. McKinley Dallin had 2 points, 2 assists in 18 minutes. Inez Betancourt had 2 points, 3 boards, 3 fouls, and went 0 of 4 from the field in 12 minutes. The Zags shot under 30% from 3. They were 41% from the field. They had 16 turnovers. The issues we've seen that plague this team, inconsistent 3-point shooting, turnover issues, they're consistent with the team that is lacking depth and lacking experience. Both those things will improve. The experience will get better as these players get more experience. That's how it works. And as assuming we get updates on Taylor Dalton and on Lauren Whitaker, and we can get them on the floor at some point, that's going to help this team as well. There are better days ahead for Lisa Fortier and the Zag women, but right now they are 4-6 on the year. They're on a 4-game losing streak. It is rough stuff. The losing streak should end. They, like the men's team, don't have a game this week, but they play on Saturday. They're playing at the Kennel against Eastern Washington, 2 p.m. Pacific time. It's a good primer. Watch that game, take a little hour break to have some dinner, and then watch the Zags at 5 o'clock. The men's team, I should say, at 5 o'clock. Eastern Washington's 2-7 on the year. Their only win over a D1 team is against Bakersfield. They've already lost to a trio of WCC teams in Washington State, Portland, and St. Mary's. They also lost at home to at UW, at Hawaii, and they lost to both North Dakota and South Dakota State. Lisa Fortier's team should be favored against Eastern Washington quite handily. They should win that game, get back in the win column. Hopefully that'll help them right the ship going into conference play shortly after that, when they play San Francisco on the road on the 19th for their first conference game of the year. Like I said, better days ahead for Lisa Fortier's team, but it has been tough to watch a team that lost so few games in the last 2 seasons already have 6 losses early on in this season. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast, folks. Thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Looking forward to getting back to you. We're going to have some conference conversation, how the WCC is doing. And of course, we're going to get you ready for that big time game against UConn on Saturday at the Madison Square Garden. Don't go anywhere. Lots of fun stuff coming your way the rest of the week. Thanks again, folks. And until next time, as always, go Zags.